From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
There's a line towards the beginning of The Dark is Rising where a character says, "Nothing is what it seems here, boy. Expect nothing and fear nothing, here or anywhere." That's from The Dark is Rising, the second book in Susan Cooper's acclaimed series of fantasy novels involving the timeless battle between the light and the dark. Will Stanton has just turned 11 and discovered, well, I'm not going to tell you what he discovered. If you haven't read it, you're going to have to discover that for yourself. It's a book that, when I read it, was chilling and gothic at times, and it was a 1974 Newbery Honor book. 2 years later, Susan Cooper published The Grey King, which was awarded a Newbery Medal. A little bit about her. She was born in Buckinghamshire, which, if you've read her books, you know is almost a character in them. She read English at Oxford University, where she was the first woman to edit the university newspaper Charwell. She was a reporter for the famed Atticus column at the Sunday Times and later a feature writer there. She came to the United States in 1963 when she married an MIT professor. Other books of hers include The Boggart, King of Shadows, The Magician's Boy. In 1996, she married her partner in writing at the time, Hume Cronin, and they were wed until his death. Her books explore the emotions of destiny, friendship, love and loss, and much else besides. She's written picture books, plays, including Foxfire, performed on Broadway. She's written poetry. She's written nonfiction for adults. She's written memoir, although with a typical twist. Dawn of Fear, published in 1970, is about growing up in wartime Britain. It is almost completely autobiographical, except for the fact that she turned herself into a boy in the book. In other words, nothing is what it seems here, boy or girl. Please welcome Susan Cooper.
Well, I turned myself into a boy because everybody always said girls will read about boys, boys will not read about girls. So writers are born, not made, like painters or composers or actors or dancers or singers. You're born that way, though of course you don't know how to do it yet. And you don't know what kind of talent you've got. I didn't know that at the beginning. I did know I was a writer, so after high school I did that degree in English at Oxford. And then I got the job as a newspaper reporter in London, mostly because it seemed the only way to earn a living by writing. I had a great time as a reporter. I interviewed everyone from politicians to truck drivers to crooks to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And every few weeks or so, I wrote a piece for a little feature that the paper had called Mainly for Children. It was the invention of the art editor who had several children. And we did it for fun, some of the reporters, for love, because we didn't get paid for it. I remember once on one of those features being allowed to ride halfway across England, standing in the locomotive of one of the very last steam trains, with the engineer shoveling coal into the furnace to make the steam. And afterwards, the engine driver said to me, "This is only the second time that any woman has ridden on the footplate of this train. The first one was the Queen." So we were the first and the second, and we were the last. The Queen and I were both a lot younger then. So because I wrote pieces like that, one day when I was about 23, the literary editor of the newspaper came into my office and handed me a bit of paper. And he said, "Look at this. You ought to try it." So I looked, and it was a notice from an English publisher of children's books offering a prize of £1,000 for a book-length family adventure story. The prize was more than I earned in a whole year, so naturally I started to write a book. But by the end of chapter 2, it changed. A character called Merriman Lion turned up, who bore a remarkable resemblance to Merlin. I'd always been obsessed with Arthurian legend. I suppose it was just soaked in. And with him came magic. And I found I was writing a fantasy instead. And I was enjoying it so much that I forgot all about the publisher's deadline and even about the £1,000. And I just went on happily writing. And the book was eventually published by someone else as Oversea Under Stone, which taught me my first lesson as a writer of fiction, which is that your imagination will always insist on doing its own thing. Around that time, there were two much older writers discovering the same thing. There was a professor who had 3 Christian names, John Ronald Rowell, and his surname was Tolkien, who was inventing the elaborate fantasy world of the Lord of the Rings, in which he lived half his life for the next 20 years. And another professor called C.S. Lewis, who was taking some children through the back of a wardrobe into Narnia. Nobody expected that. When I was an undergraduate at Oxford, Tolkien was lecturing us on Anglo-Saxon literature and Lewis on Renaissance literature. They were amiable, pipe-smoking, elderly gentlemen, often to be found drinking beer in a pub called the Eagle and Child, known to us and to them as the Bird and Baby. And to look at them, you'd never have guessed what they were up to in their spare time. Tolkien wrote later to W.H. Auden, "I wrote the trilogy as a personal satisfaction, driven to it by the scarcity of literature of the sort that I wanted to read." So you see, some of us aren't writing for children, we're writing for ourselves. What Maurice Sendak calls the child self. For an imagination that sees things in a particular way. And it isn't always the way that other people see things. I'll tell you a story about that. There was one morning, back in those pre-computer days when I was a reporter, when I was sitting at my typewriter looking out of the window, thinking, staring at the sky. The newsroom was on the top floor, and all you could see was sky over the rooftops with a few chimneys. And on one rooftop there was a tall flagpole, and I saw that there was a man climbing up it, presumably to paint it or fix the ropes or something. He was still there when I looked up a few minutes later, and he didn't seem to have moved much. So I began to get worried about him. Perhaps he was stuck. Perhaps he was yelling with nobody out there to hear him. Another reporter came past my desk, and I said, "Hey, look at that man out on the flagpole. He's been there a long time. Do you think he's all right?" So she looked out at the flagpole and then back at me, and she said very gently, "Susan, that's not a man, it's a flag." Perception is a matter of the way you see things. I'm very short-sighted, of course, hence these. So was the American writer James Thurber. A friend of mine interviewed him once, and Thurber said a lovely thing. "Those of us who are half blind are luckier than you think," he said. "Where you see a paper bag blowing down the street, we see a little old lady turning somersaults." Isn't that nice? Thurber wrote fantasy as well as drawing great cartoons. I've never done any research to find out whether all fantasy writers have trouble with their eyesight. But the thing is, the imagination takes over where the eyes leave off. We live in the same world as the rest of you. Its realities are the same, but we perceive them differently. And if you are a dedicated fantasy reader, so do you. If you're a fantasy writer, you're always thinking, what if? Maybe you read a little boy a bedtime story about a dragon, and then put the book on the bedside table and kiss him goodnight as he snuggles down. You leave the room. But as you're leaving, you think to yourself, what if he opens one eye and sees the cover of the book rising open? And what if the dragon inside comes out and flies out of the window to wonderful adventures with the little boy on his back? That's what led to one of my own picture books, written for my grandson, Matthew, which was called, of course, Matthew's Dragon. But the what if always comes by accident. Where do you get your ideas? Children say constantly. And there is no answer to this question. In the bath, you can say, or when I'm walking, or looking out of the window of aeroplanes. But generally, I tell them, there's a small dark room at the back of my mind with a locked door that has no key. I can't open this door, I tell them. But once in a while, it swings open of its own accord, and an idea runs out. This doesn't satisfy them. They're sure there's some secret I'm not telling them. I wish there were. That small dark room is the unconscious mind, I guess. And inside it are all the stored up things that feed anyone's imagination. Everyone's small room is different. It depends what your life has been like, what you've seen, or done, or felt, or read. Inside my small room, there was and is a very strong sense of place and time. From having grown up in a little country which has 5,000 years of human history. And in there, too, are a lot of images from fairy tale and myth, because I read a great deal of that when I was a small bookworm. And the last thing in that room, in my head, is a very strong sense of good and evil, because I grew up in England during World War II. And starting when I was in first grade, we used to go to school carrying not just a book bag, but a gas mask. And up in the sky, there were enormous silver balloons, 60 feet long, floating on cables, looking like huge fish. They were called barrage balloons, and they were supposed to discourage the enemy planes that flew over every day, and more often every night, dropping bombs on us. But the planes came anyway, balloons or not, So we spent a great many nights in the air raid shelter, watching the candle flame shake as the bombs fell outside. And if you grow up knowing someone is deliberately trying to kill you, you have a very strong sense of the good guys and the bad guys, good and evil, which is a sense that must certainly be there today in the mind of thousands of kids in the Middle East and Afghanistan. And who knows what books some of them will write. For me, at any rate, that awareness, I think, was a very big ingredient in the mixture that produced fantasy. However, back when I was a young reporter, after I'd written my first fantasy, Oversea Under Stone, I didn't write another one. Instead, as John told you, I did something that made my family, my friends, and my editor, especially my editor, think I'd gone totally crazy. At the age of 27, I married an American, an MIT professor who was 20 years older than me and had 3 teenage children. And I pulled up all my very deep British roots and came to live in Massachusetts. For the next 10 years, you'd never have known I was a fantasy writer. The little dark room of the unconscious was in shock, and it stayed firmly shut. I wrote a weekly column for a British newspaper. I wrote a non-fiction book and a realistic novel. I had 2 babies, and I had to deal with discovering that my youngest stepson, unbeknownst to my husband, was addicted to heroin. I was into a lot of very heavy realism. And I was very homesick. I was suffering without really knowing it from that kind of home longing that the Welsh call hiraeth. And a lot of things were going on in that part of my head that I couldn't see. And then one winter day around 1970, I was stumbling through a snowy wood on cross-country skis, thinking that the branches sticking up out of the snow looked like the antlers of buried deer. And just for a second, that little door in the mind opened. I thought suddenly, someday I'm going to write a book set in deep snow like this, but in England, about a boy who wakes up on his 11th birthday and finds he can work magic. That was all, just the idea. I played with it a bit. I couldn't make it work. So I put it aside and wrote another non-fiction book. But the idea didn't go away. A year or 2 later, I happened to reread my own book on Oversea Under Stone. And I thought of that boy waking up on his snowy 11th birthday. And suddenly that little door swung open again. And this time it didn't swing shut for quite a while. I thought, the boy's story links with this first one. And there are more stories with merriman all through them. And I found myself writing down the pattern of an overall sequence of 5 books, each in its own way about the long struggle between good and evil, the light and the dark. Oversea Under Stone had been the first. And on this astonishing day, I wrote a page full of little paragraphs about each book, the setting, its time of year, and the people who would be in it. And before I started to write the second book, The Dark is Rising, I wrote the last page of the very last book. I used it, too, when I finally got there, 6 years later. When I was a child, I inhaled books like a vacuum cleaner. Anything and everything. But most of the images from that time that stay in my head are from fairy tale or myth, or from one of the very few early fantasies that had survived from my parents' generation. Moments like the one in a book by E. Nesbit called The Phoenix and the Carpet. Anybody heard of E. Nesbit? Yeah. There's a family of children who find an egg-shaped stone in a rolled-up second-hand rug. And one of them tosses it into the fire, burning in the fireplace. this being written in the days before central heating. And in the fire, to their amazement, the stone egg hatches into a golden flame-coloured bird. Listen to this bit. The bird rose in its nest of fire, stretched its wings, and flew out into the room. It flew round and round, and where it passed, the air was warm. Then it perched on the fireplace fender. The children looked at each other. Cyril put out a hand towards the bird. It put its head on one side and looked up at him, as you may have seen a parrot do when it's about to speak, so that the children were hardly astonished at all when it said, "Be careful, I'm not nearly cool yet." Magic. Fantasy. I could give you half a dozen tiny moments like that from the days when I was that child curled up in a chair, reading. Magic stays with you. Maybe it stayed with you too, and that's why you're in the teen tent at this particular moment. The 5 books of the Dark is Rising sequence were written in the 1970s, and they've been in print now for nearly 40 years, which astounds me. Like every other... Hey. I wasn't bragging. Like every other children's author, I get some wonderful letters from the readers. I don't mean the ones that say, "Dear Miss Copper, we are doing you in class." I mean the real ones. It's a heartwarming collection by now, this sharing of the imagination between a writer who made a book and the kids who've been living inside her story, just as she was when she wrote it. We're friends, all of us, through the words we've written down or read. I never properly appreciated this until a few years ago, when the book, The Dark is Rising, the second in the sequence, was made into a movie. I turned down film offers for decades, but this one had come from somebody I knew and trusted, unwisely, as it turned out. It was a heartbreakingly bad film in which they changed almost everything about the book, starting by turning my English 11-year-old hero into a girl-chasing American adolescent. They even changed the title in the end, mercifully, and called it The Seeker. And after it came out, I was in a state of suicidal gloom, only slightly comforted by the very bad reviews. And then I began to hear about a surge of indignant protests about the film at assorted places on the internet. They were from adults and teens as well as children. And these people seemed to know the 5 books better than I did myself. They used phrases like horrible mangled mess. And what were they thinking? One woman wrote that her 26-year-old daughter, a comic book artist, was designing herself a T-shirt that read, "My Will Stanton is 11 years old." Another one wrote, "Don't see this movie. Don't let your kids see this movie. Do yourselves a favor and read the book instead." And Wikipedia picked up a quotation that read, "During filming in Bucharest, Romania, there was a joke on the Dark is Rising set that only 3 things had been changed from the original 1973 novel: the nationality of the lead character, Will Stanton, his age, and everything else that happens in the story." This came from a blog entitled "The Dark is Sinking." There were hundreds of these resentful protests online. They went on and on. They used words that I can't repeat on this platform. One of the repeatable ones said, "I wasted $750 on this movie, but had to be sure it was as awful as I feared. It was worse." And I stopped being suicidal, and I realized that a wonderful thing had happened. these angry people weren't just the child readers, they were also the child readers 5, 10, 30 years later. There was once a headmaster of a celebrated school in Britain which had particularly progressive methods. And when he retired, somebody asked him what he felt he'd accomplished. And he shook his head. "We can never judge the success of any aspect of education," he said, "until the children grow up and can tell us what really happened." And the same goes for books. There are some advantages to being a very senior writer. You're old enough for some of the children to have grown up and tell you what happened. When I read those defenses of fantasy from the internet, I felt that after all there was some point to what people like me are trying to do. My niece in Britain even reported gleefully that there was a chat group out of the University of Oxford called "Keep Your Filthy Hands Off, the Dark is Rising." It's that magic link between the imagination of the writer and the imagination of the reader. The film had broken it, but the readers were keeping the link alive. A few years ago, I went to Kentucky to give a lecture, and without warning, I was told that I also had to talk to an audience of children at the local library. "It won't take more than an hour or so," said my keeper, merrily driving me off to the library. "And they're all looking forward to it so much. They've given up their Saturday morning, especially." Now, this is a shameful confession, but I am terrified of talking to young children. I don't do schools, as we say in the trade, because although I can write for them, I haven't a clue how to entertain them in person. While the librarian introduced me, I looked in horror at this bunch of maybe 150 kids, aged from about 3 up to maybe 12, most of them squirming on the floor. And then mercifully, I noticed a display of my books on the table beside me. So I grabbed the nearest one, a picture book called Matthew's Dragon, the What If book, remember? And I started to read it to them. And suddenly they sat still. And the room took on that lovely prickling silence that tells you when an audience is really listening. I went on reading, showing them the pictures as I went. And then something happened. From the front row of the children sitting on the floor, a little girl, about 4 years old, I guess, began inching herself towards me. She had straggly blonde hair and a pale little face, and big eyes fixed on me. And as the story went on, she just kept quietly shunting herself forward on her hands, at intervals, listening. At first I thought she must be a short-sighted kid who wanted to look at the pictures. But by coming close, she couldn't see the pictures at all, because I was holding the book up high every time I turned a page. She kept on coming, though, till her head was resting against my knee. I think the truth was that she wanted to get inside the story. So I finished reading with my hand on the small blonde head. And afterwards we had a very lively question time. And the kids and I were indeed communicating. But it was the story and the small entranced girl that had brought us together. The link between the imagination of the storyteller and the imagination of the reader. In this case, the listener. That's why this festival is so important. Like parents reading to children and going on reading after that with them. Books provide that hugely powerful link that awakens and feeds the imagination. Nothing else does it so well. E-books are fine, but the ultimate magic is the real book that pulls you inside the story and perhaps changes you. That's why a bunch of us from the National Children's Book and Literacy Alliance were up on a stage yesterday, making ourselves look a little foolish, playing the exquisite corpse game, pushing story, being missionaries for the imagination and the book. I hope you'll ask me questions about writing or the books or almost anything. Almost anything. But before that, I want to end by reading you a short, simple poem that shows you how easily your own imagination can make a picture sent to you by the imagination of someone else. It was written by one of my oldest friends, who was a wonderful English poet named Adrian Mitchell. His poem is called To See a Unicorn, and it will ask you to do a couple of things while you're listening to it. They're easy things, but it may be a little difficult with all the stuff going on around us. So try. Here's how it goes. This is the way to see a unicorn. Close your eyes. Everybody. Everyone here. Go on. Close your eyes until the poem tells you to open them. And listen. And see. See a sandy path in front of you. Follow that path over a hill of grass and daisies. Take a deep breath. See a bumpy little stream in front of you. Follow that stream into a forest. Take a deep breath. See a clearing in the forest and a pool like a mirror for the trees. Take a deep breath. Be still. Who walks so gracefully down to the pool and bends to drink the dark, cool water? It is the unicorn, the loveliest of animals. He loves to wander in the forest of your dreams. See his silver mane and his golden horn. See his gentle eyes. Hear the beating of his heart. Be still. Open your eyes when you want to open your eyes. Remember the unicorn. Questions? Somebody has to be first.
Hi. First off, I just want to say that The Dark is Rising really captured my imagination as a kid and made me magically want to know how to speak Welsh, because I was jealous of all those characters and thought, wow, this seems like so cool. Anyway, so I just was wondering, why Wales? I mean, was it because of some of the roots of Arthurian legend or some personal connection? You said you're from Buckinghamshire, so I was just wondering, why Wales?
Yeah, I was from Buckinghamshire, but my mother's mother, Mary Ellen Davies, was a little Welsh girl in a village called Aberdyfi, in what is the centre of the country that my books are set in, the ones that use Wales. My great-grandfather was a sea captain with 3 small children, and one Sunday his ship was in Liverpool harbour, and being a good Welshman, he got in his little dinghy to row to go to church, and the dinghy tipped, and like a lot of seamen, he couldn't swim, so he drowned. And the 3 small children had to make their own way in life very early. The two boys went to sea, and my little grandmother was sent at the age of 14 to go to London into service, like the little maids in Upstairs, Downstairs, and Downton Abbey and all that. So there were still cousins in the village of Abu Dhabi. We went there on holidays as children, and when my parents retired, they went there to live for the last 20 years of their life. So it was home for me then. All the places I love are in those 5 books, and that's one of them.
Okay, thank you.
In the interest of full disclosure, I have to admit that I haven't read your books, but I'm anxious to do so now after hearing you talk. But I'm curious, do you read any contemporary teen authors, and who are your favorites?
Oh, favorites is such a hard word because you have to leave so many people out. And there are so many good ones. It's Alan Garner is the same age as me. He is an English fantasist. We were at Oxford together. I can tell you people I love reading, but I can't say favorites. I mean, I'm mute. I'm sorry. It's a case of not wanting to leave anybody out.
Hi, I was wondering, why is the series and your second book the same title?
Tilt the microphone down a little bit to yourself, love. I can't quite hear you.
Why is the title of your second book and the title the same thing? The same title?
Well, I tell you, we had a lot of trouble with titles. The overall title of the whole thing was going to be The Dark is Rising, as it is. The second book, when I wrote it, I called it The Gift of Gramarye. Gramarye is an old word for magic. And my editor said, you can't possibly use that title. The kids will think it's a book about grammar and be bored rigid. So we stole the title from the whole series and we put it on the second book. Everybody cheats a bit.
Thank you.
Hi. First of all, I want to say what a big fan I am, and I came from upstate New York and ran the last bit of the way to come see you today, so I'm really glad to see you.
Thank you.
And I wanted to know, I was wondering, when it comes to legends like the Grey King and other legends that are in your book, did you have to do a lot of digging and researching to find those, or were they in common parlance and in the culture in England and Wales and everywhere else, as they are in the story, as people will always tell Will about the Grey King, for example? Does everyone know a lot of these stories and they just get passed around and use them, or did you have to do a lot of searching for them?
There's a huge amount of research. I have shelves and shelves of books about myth, English, Welsh, you name it. When you are published for children, you had better get things right, because if you get anything wrong, kids write and tell you so in very short order. I get rather downhearted when I have an idea that requires all that research, and it's happened to me twice. Once I thought, I worship William Shakespeare, and I thought a writer can meet anybody by writing about them. So I want to write a book about Shakespeare. But I kept putting it off and putting it off until a friend of mine kept nagging me to do it. And then I made it a time slip so that it wasn't all set in Elizabethan England. Part of it was a boy finding himself acting in Shakespeare's company. Then I had another idea about, this is a long answer to a short question. When Admiral Lord Nelson, who was one of our national heroes, was killed at the Battle of Trafalgar, There was a great state funeral all through London, and the sailors of his ship, Victory, carried the tattered flag from the ship in the funeral procession. And at the funeral service in St. Paul's Cathedral, they were supposed to drape the flag over his coffin as it went down into the crypt. And they couldn't bear it because the flag was the only thing they had left of their wonderful Nelson. And so they tore it, and each one of them kept a piece. And that little story stayed in my head for ages. I kept thinking, what if one of those crew members was a boy, a ship's boy, and what if he kept a piece of that flag? And what if it came down to the present day and another child, a girl, found it? What if, and I went on with the what ifs, and putting it off because I knew I'd have to do all this research about England of the time of Nelson. But eventually the what ifs got so strong that I spent 2 years reading up on the Napoleonic Wars and going to Britain and visiting the preserved ship Victory. So there's a lot of research.
And if you go back to Wales today, say, would you hear some of these legends spoken?
Come closer.
If you went to Wales or to England today, and would you hear some of these legends spoken today by people? Like if you went near where the Grey King is set.
Somebody tell me, I didn't hear the last part of that question. Can you come closer to the mic?
I'm sorry. If you went back to Wales or to England, say where the legends like the Grey King are set, would you hear people talking about them? If you mentioned them, would people know, or are they buried too deep?
Oh,
now?
they're there. They're
They're
there.
there.
People. The Grey King is called the Brennan Thread.
Mm-hmm.
They're real.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
It's actually kind of a great honor to even be asking you questions. I've dreamt of it for about 20 years. But your sense of place and the places that are real in your books that you've written about are so strong. Like, I've spent about 5 months working abroad in England, and I had to, even though it was the middle of January, go to Cadair Idris and attempt to
you were
climb
brave.
it. I was the only one on the mountain. And it was sheltering from like 50-mile-per-hour winds or so behind a rock that I was thinking, you should really write a book of your own, of like Susan Cooper's Britain or something like that, to not just the stuff that's in your books, but even more that are places all over the island or all the British Isles that you really enjoy and were close to you, because I think there would be a large audience for that. Have you ever considered something like that?
I've in my computer there is something called Susan Cooper's Way to Wales, which goes through those places, and when any of my friends go to Britain, I force it on them. But I don't think they try it in January.
That's true. Any chance of publishing that, perhaps?
We'll see.
Hi. I just want to say that I've been a really big fan since I was when I first read it, it was kind of confusing, but I just loved it so much that I read it again and again, and I actually cracked the binding on my book, and it split in half. But I was just wondering, where did you get the idea for Merriman? Did it just pop up in your head, or was it something that you thought about and just kept adding layers and layers to his character?
For Merriman?
Mm-hmm.
It was, I think it was half subconscious and half aware what I was doing. But there was a point in Oversea Under Stone where the youngest child, Barney, they've been through all these extraordinary adventures with their great-uncle, who is not their real great-uncle. It's the way the English talk about close friends as uncles. And he looks at him across a room and he says, Merriman Lion, Merry Lion, Merlin. And I think when I sat there writing that, I thought, of course. So it was, I had to get there too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.